My name is Stanford Lipsey. I was born in Omaha, Nebraska on October 8th, 1927. My parents were Molly and Jake Brick. Both of my parents came over as young people from Russia. My father started out as a groceryman with his brother Mort. Then during World War I, he went into the Army. After he came back, he was still in the grocery business with my Uncle Mort, and that was on the 20th in California. That was a time when grocers gave credit, and two stories that I remember are that my father and his brother lent some money to someone, or not lent, actually gave credit to someone for buying some groceries. The individual could not pay his bill, so he gave them instead 640 acres of land in Wyoming. And the only vacation I took when I was a youngster was in 1939. We drove up to those acreages, and of course all they were was sagebrush and rattlesnakes and that kind of thing. But it was kind of interesting, it was fun. The other thing I remember is there was a streetcar strike, this I've been told, in the 20s, and my father and his brother helped out the strikers, the employees, with food. My father then went on to open Lipsey Produce, which is a business that specialized in meat, poultry, and eggs. He would buy meat from the slaughter yards in South Omaha and get them in half quarters, 4 quarters, and then cut them up for steaks and things like that, mainly for restaurants. On poultry, that was a very big part of his business, and there he had a huge poultry operation and sold not only to restaurants but to the grocers in the area. And then as a byproduct, he had eggs, and that was not quite as important as the rest. During World War II, when so many men were away at service, he got me a driver's license while I was still 15. Ordinarily, you have to be 16. And during the summer when I wasn't in high school, I drove a truck and delivered orders to customers in the Omaha area. I had one sister, Pearl, who was 7 years older than myself, and unfortunately she just passed away a couple months ago. The house that I originally remember living in was on South 41st Street. That house is now gone as the University of Nebraska campus has expanded. My main house I remember was on the corner of 56th and Jones. It was and still is, a 2-story brick house on the corner with a very large lawn. And I remember mowing that lawn when they didn't have power lawnmowers. So not only was it a lot to mow, but it had several banks. You had to be very careful with 1 foot braced against the hill to mow the lawn. And the same thing went for the winter when we had sidewalks to shovel. In that house, we had a coal furnace, but it had sort of a drive on it that fed small chunks of coal. But I can remember my father paying a lot of attention to that furnace. We had no air conditioning, and I had a room on the 2nd floor, and I can remember when it was so hot in the summer, I'd open the window, and my bed was right next to the window, and I'd kind of lay on the windowsill so I got a breeze. Those were very simple times, as was the case across the entire country before World War II. The idea of great travels or foreign countries were not given great consideration, and Omaha was and still is just a wonderful place for kids to grow up, for families to mature. I went to Columbia grade school, but I can barely remember it because I think when I was about 8 or 9, we moved to 56 and Jones, and there I went to Washington School. I just left this morning having breakfast with Chuck Peterson, who was my best friend in grade school, and that was an interesting time. I was an entire Washington school that I knew, there were only 2 Jewish kids, myself and Justin Manvitz. So I was used to being completely in a Gentile atmosphere. I was bar mitzvahed and then graduated in 1941. I went to Central High, which is a fabulous institution, still is. I keep in touch with them. I then went to the University of Michigan, which I went through in 3 years because I didn't quite know what I wanted to do and I was anxious to get through. But as I look back, as wonderful as the University of Michigan was, I'm not certain that Central High didn't mean more in my life. I just learned an awful lot there, and the teachers there were unusual and unique. I'm sure they're still good, but when I think of what's happening in school districts across the country, this certainly was the highest level of education. And people that graduated well from Central High School could almost go to the school of their choice, Harvard, Princeton, Yale. My sister went to the University of Omaha. That was before it was the University of Omaha, Nebraska. She went to Iowa, I think for 1 year, the University of Iowa in Iowa City. In 1940, I think it was, she married a man named Fred Katz. Fred Katz had come to the Lincoln Flying School in Lincoln, Nebraska, and he knew a fellow named Warren Ackerman, so he drove up to Omaha, and he got introduced to Pearl, and by Omaha standards, relatively short order, they got married. As I said, Freddie was a pilot. I remember on December 7th, 1941, Fred and Pearl were sitting with my folks in the backyard, and I was up in my room and I had a radio on, and I yelled down, "Fred, the Japanese have just bombed Pearl Harbor." And Fred said to me, "Stan, you better be kidding." And of course, I wasn't kidding. Fred then joined the Naval Air Force. He was a little old to become a combat flyer, but he became a ferry pilot. He ferried planes from the East Coast, for example, like the Grumman factory on Long Island, to Southwest California, where the aircraft carriers were. And that familiarity with California led them, after the war, Pearl and Fred, to move to Los Angeles. I got called by my dad during my junior year at Michigan, or my next to last year, saying that he and Mom were going to move to California and join Pearl and Fred, and did I want the business? And I said to him, "No, I don't." So he sold the business. He sold it to Norm Bordy and Tony Cohn. They kept the name because the Lipsey name had such a good reputation, good identification. And as a matter of fact, while I was in college and went out to California, we went to a very famous restaurant there called Chasen's. And Dave Chasen asked if he could talk with my father, and I went with him into his office, and he wanted to know if my father could get him a carload of meat, because after World War II, there was a shortage of everything, including good steaks, and of course Omaha had a fabulous reputation for good steaks. In high school, I was active in sort of routine things. I was active in the ROTC. I was a member of the crack squad, which was very important to me, made a big impression. That was a unit of 15 ROTC enlisted men or officers who did drills and the entire drill was silent. There was no commands, and you dealt with what was a chrome-plated Enfield rifle, a long rifle that was chrome-plated and used in, well, it was used in the Spanish-American War, and then they chrome-plated them, and it was quite an exercise because we would throw these rifles around and change them and slap them and make certain noises, and to this day my hands still perspire from slapping that rifle. I don't know what it triggered, but it did trigger that. I did well in school. A friend was Stanley Perlmeter. Stan was a couple years older than me, and he'd gone to the University of Michigan, and he recommended it so highly. So when it came time to think about college, my parents didn't give me any instruction. In fact, I think one of the unusual things about my upbringing was that my parents really let me develop by myself. There was not heavy guidance. There was an enormous amount of love, and even though we grew up in the Depression, I never realized it because we had plenty to eat, especially my dad was in the meat business. I can remember in high school coming home from a date, and I would, like at midnight, and I'd pull a beef tenderloin out, and I'd cut a slice off and broil myself a fillet at about midnight. But my parents just gave me an enormous amount of love and a comfort in growing up. But I think that I developed an independence on my own just because of how they treated me and how they handled me. So I went to the University of Michigan. Arnold Linsman went with me. Bob Chapman went with me. And I went and got a degree in economics there. In high school, I was a member of the Pi Tau Pi fraternity. In college, I was a member of Zeta Beta Tau, although I wasn't that active in the fraternity. And 6 of us moved out of the fraternity the last 2 of the 3 years I was in college because it was crowded. It was a time when the veterans were coming back, and we moved into the rear of a professor's house about 2 blocks away from the fraternity house, and we became very close friends, the 6 of us there, and I still talk and see many of them to this day. When I was in college, I had already become very interested in photography, largely because of Pearl's husband, Fred Katz, who was an excellent photographer. So when I went to Michigan, probably the main extracurricular activity that I participated in was photography. I was a photographer for the daily newspaper, and I was photography editor of the yearbook. And that was a pretty big job for a school that large, and in fact, we were paid for the work we did. So that was very interesting. Other than that, I would say that if I had it to do all over again, I would have done a lot more in college, but I suppose when you go to college and you're 17 years old, you're not in Omaha, Nebraska, right at the time of World War II ending, you probably don't have the worldly desires that we all experience now. I dated in high school Jean Blacker, and she went to Northwestern, and our relationship continued despite the fact that we were at separate universities. I graduated, as I said, in 3 years and went back out to where my parents were in Los Angeles. Jean came out and finished her final year at UCLA, but right at that time, she contracted multiple sclerosis, and she had a very difficult time of it, to a great extent because it was so unknown. And she had problems both in balance and vision, but in any case, on June 15th, 1949, we were married at the Bel Air Hotel in Bel Air, California. And as I said, I went through college in 3 years mainly because I didn't know what I wanted to do, and it was just kind of driving me towards finding that out. When I graduated Michigan in June of 1948, I'm 20 years old. I'm a kid from Omaha in Los Angeles. My dad would have backed me in going into a business, and we looked at businesses, but we didn't find anything that we thought made sense. And I had friends say to me that whatever you do, you're going to have to be involved in selling, and you ought to get a job selling. So I looked at the various ads, and I went to an employment agency, and I got a job with Libby McNeil and Libby, the canned goods manufacturer. And I started out in public relations in their baby food division, and then eventually I went into sales. We lived just off of Vermont in Los Angeles, and following World War II, young people like myself had to belong either to a reserve unit or a National Guard unit. And I really didn't know much. I didn't think about how I should go about that. But there was a reserve infantry division not so far from my house, and I joined that. That was the 40th Infantry Division. I rose to the ranks of becoming a tech sergeant, and I was in their officers candidate school, and I was leading a platoon in a heavy weapons company, and in the process of getting my commission. And I hadn't found anything I really wanted to do in Los Angeles, and I still didn't know what I wanted to do. Jean had MS. Her folks would have loved to have her come back to Omaha, and her father owned 2 free weekly papers, 2 small papers called the Dundee News and the South Omaha Sun. And I thought, well, if I go back there and I work at those papers and sell advertising, I'll come into contact with a whole lot of businessmen. I'll get insights into those businesses, because the way you grow volume and prosper, one of the ways is to sell is through advertising and promotion. So I went back there and I did just that. And but instead of finding the business I wanted to get into, I found that I liked very much the newspaper business. Jean's MS, because of Jean's MS, she was advised, or we were advised, that she should not get pregnant. So we adopted 2 children, a daughter Janet in 1953 and a son Dan in 1956. We initially lived in a apartment on 49th in Chicago, I guess it is, 49th in Chicago. And then we built a home on 63rd and Glenwood Road. And that's pretty much where our kids grew up. They went to school there. They went to school at Lewis and Clark Junior High. Then they went to Central High. And I would be one of the fathers that would carpool and take a whole bunch of kids down together. That was a lot of fun. One of the people that lived across the street from us was Kiwi Kirschenbaum, and Jim Kirschenbaum was the same age as my daughter Janet, and they were very, very good friends and remained very good friends for many, many years, still are. The Sun paper, what happened at the Sun was that my father-in-law, while he was very much involved in it, officed downtown and was in a number of activities, not the least of which was Jewish philanthropies, where he was a driving force. But he was also interested in investments in the stock market. And in a reasonable amount of time, I had matriculated through being a advertising salesman, a reporter, an editor. I had done enough in circulation to know what that was all about. And in 1950, while I was still in Los Angeles, but getting ready to move to Omaha, the Korean War broke out, and the first two reserve units called was one in Oklahoma and this 40th Infantry Division that I was a part of. And as I said, I was a platoon leader in a heavy weapons company that had 81 millimeter mortars, 50 caliber water-cooled machine guns, and a new piece of equipment called a 75 millimeter recoilless rifle. And that was an anti-tank weapon. And it could be fired on a tripod or mounted on a Jeep. And the principle was, the reason they were able to get an anti-tank weapon with that much, that kind of caliber, was it didn't have any kick, because it had what they called a back blast. So the shell would go out the front, and this back blast, which is a huge ball of fire, would come out the rear. In fact, when we used to demonstrate the equipment in this country, we'd take ammunition boxes, which were very thick. The wood was an inch thick, and we'd stack them up, and we'd fire a shell, and the back blast would just ignite and destroy these weapons. But as I said, I narrowly missed going to Korea. In fact, they called me up and wanted me to go, but I had already made plans to move to Omaha. And a friend of mine named Jim Hope, who headed another platoon in the same company, did go to Korea. And I would make frequent trips back from Omaha to Los Angeles because my folks and my sister were still there. And I would see him, and he said they just got slaughtered, that the 75 millimeter recoilless rifle, the muzzle velocity was so slow going towards the tank. It took forever for the shell to get there, but the tank saw the back blast immediately, and they were able to zero in. And the reserve units in those days aren't like the reserve units today in Iraq. I just marvel at the fact that this country is able to call up reserve units and send them right into combat. In 1950, we had World War II equipment. We weren't that well trained. The units weren't full in terms of manning, and that was really a bad experience. If you remember, originally in Korea, all the U.S. troops got forced back to the Pusan perimeter at the southeast corner of the country. But when I came back to Omaha, you still had to belong to a guard or a reserve unit, and it seemed natural that Offutt Air Force Base was nearby. Besides which, I had learned something in the infantry, and this idea of camping out with the bugs and using latrines. And I remember we used to go away every year for 2 weeks for encampments, and you didn't live in barracks, you didn't get a shower. And I remember we had these mess kits, and one day I took whatever they had that they put in the mess kit, and they put a piece of white bread on top, and I walked a few yards to sit down to eat, and when I got there, the bread was toasted. And I thought to myself, there's got to be an easier way than this. So I did enter Reserve Flight Carrier Wing at Offutt Air Force Base, and I was in that wing with Donald Vann and Dick Goldman. I was a tech sergeant. When they saw my experience, they assigned me to do information, and then shortly after I joined that unit, the whole unit got called up. And at that time, what they had said is that if you're in a unit and you get called up, you'll go as a unit. But in this particular instance, they split the unit up and used the airmen as fill-ins for other units. I think Dick and Don went to Topeka. They saw that I had all this news experience in the background, and they assigned me to the information office at Offutt Air Force Base, where I became the non-commissioned officer in charge of the office, and I was the editor of the newspaper, the Air Pulse, which was a fine paper, an award-winning paper. The officer commanding the office was a fellow named Bob Chamberlain that got recalled during Korea. He'd been the editor of the Colorado Springs Daily, was a very competent individual. One of the most unusual experiences I had is there's an island off of New Rochelle, New York called David's Island. And in World War II, it was a prisoner of war island. And the people of New Rochelle went to the Department of Defense and said, we don't like this. We want something out there that's more to our what we think is appropriate for this area. So they made it a combined service information and chaplain school. So the information school had people from the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, and the same for the chaplain school. I got assigned to go to that island, and with me there was assigned a fellow in the office named Jim Clements. He was a journalism graduate from the University of Minnesota. In those days you got per diem, which were these long tickets that you tore off, and they were good for food and whatever. So when I had all these per diem tickets, and I was prepared to take the train as a serviceman to New Rochelle, and then at the last minute, this huge plane became available, and this was a double-decker troop transport plane that I don't know held how many troops. And the reason it became available at the last minute is that the pilot that was going to fly it was General Curtis LeMay, the commanding general of the Strategic Air Command, later to become the head of all branches of service, chief of staff, and later to become a vice presidential candidate. But at the last minute he was told, or we were told, that we could get on that flight. So I turned my per diem in. I got on the plane. Jim Clements got on the plane. I didn't think anything of it. And I went to this school, and if you graduated #1 in the school, you got to have lunch with whoever the speaker was for graduation, and you got your choice of assignment any place in the country. And the speaker was Edward R. Murrow, so that was just a tremendous treat for me. And then I had to decide what to do, because there was an all-services information school in Los Angeles. It was very attractive, but Jean had multiple sclerosis. Her parents were there, and I thought I better go back to Omaha, which I did. When I got back to Omaha and was back in the office editing the paper and what have you, they had a system where they rotated what they called charge of quarters. Off at Air Force Base, I don't know if they still have it, but they had these old Spanish-American War double-deck brick barracks, open-bayed barracks. And if you were charge of quarters, you went over there at whatever it was, 5 o'clock, and you were up all night long because you were charge of quarters. Now, I didn't live on the base. I lived in Omaha and just drove out there every day. When I got to being charge of quarters, there was this big guy in a civilian suit, and he introduced himself, and he says, "I'm a member of the Office of Strategic Investigations," which is the counterpart to the FBI. And he said to me, "Did you go to Fort Slocum on David's Island?" "Yes." "Did you fly so-and-so?" "Yes." "Did Corporal Clements go with you?" "Yes." Da-da-da. Well, it turned out that Clements kept his per diem and forged an officer's name to get on this plane, and they caught him. And that very day that I was charge of quarters, I was put on orders to go to Korea. But because I was the only witness going and coming with this guy Clements, they took me off of orders because they court-martialed him. And they took me over to OSI headquarters, and they wanted me, of course, to testify against him. And I really didn't know all that much, and I wasn't inclined to testify against him, but they really put the fear of God in me. They talked to me about how I would be spending the rest of my life at Fort Leavenworth making small rocks from big rocks, and it was really frightening. In fact, I remember going to Johnny's Cafe one day, and I'm in uniform, and it's at the height of this, and I'm having lunch with my father-in-law, and I must have had this horribly worried look on my face because a nice lady came over and she said, patted me on the shoulder, said, "Don't worry, son, it's going to be okay." So I thought that was pretty good. To make a long story short, because it is a fascinating story from a legal standpoint, he was convicted of a bad conduct discharge, which I think is 5 years in jail, and you get removed from the service. When it went up to SAC headquarters judge advocate, they decided that wasn't strong enough punishment for someone that had forged an officer's name. So they threw it out and tried him again. And again, I'm put on, at that time I was on the orders to go to England. So we go through the whole thing again, and all this time I'm dying to go to Korea or England, anything to get out of there, because I was really worried about what might happen to me. So this time he has, as his attorney, because his other attorney had left, a young second lieutenant named Goodman, just graduated from the University of Alabama Law School. And when you're in the service, if you're an attorney, you become a captain almost immediately. In fact, he got his captain's bars during it. Well, the case of the prosecution was that Clements had confessed to doing the whole thing, so it's open and shut. And Goodman made a case that he was forced to do it, that he was sweated, and the prosecuting attorney said that's not so, he wasn't there that long, and we can prove it because no matter who you are, even if you're LeMay, when you go in there, you have to sign your name in, and when you leave, you have to sign your name out. So it was about lunchtime, and the head of the court said to the prosecuting attorney, "Go over and get the book and bring it back, and we'll take a look at it." So I see Goodman looking at the book while the court's waiting to convene, and he approaches the court and says, "I'd like to swear in on the witness stand the prosecuting attorney." So that was a shock to everybody, but they let him do it, and he said, "Now, when you go to the Office of Strategic Investigations, you must sign in and you must sign out, and you have to give the date and the time." He said, the guy said, "Absolutely." He says, "Well, here's the book. Where's your name? You went over there and your name isn't there." So this guy Clements got acquitted, and he got out of the service. About the same time, not too long after that, my dad fell very ill in Los Angeles, and I was almost through with my tour, and I got what they called a hardship discharge. I got out a little bit early, and I went out there, and my dad did pass away. My dad and my mother, I would say, were among the most extraordinarily close people that I could ever know. I've told so many people that I never heard a crossword between them. And so my mother took it very hard. Even though she was still relatively young and very attractive, she never went with any other men. And she lived about 13 years past the time when my father passed away. And we would go out and see her. So that was pretty much the chapter in Los Angeles. When I came back and I was out of the Air Force, I went back to what was the South Omaha Sun, and I had the idea after a while that if we could get all the weekly papers together, we would have a package that would be worth selling in competition to the Omaha World Herald. And it's kind of interesting, my father-in-law had worked at the North Omaha Booster. He really didn't see much value in doing that, but he indulged me, and we did it, and that in fact put us in a position to have a complete package of citywide coverage to sell, and we did that. Later, we decided that we would try and make the paper a paid circulation paper, and we did that. And at one time it had 50,000 audited paid circulation. That's significant. It was one of the largest ABC audited paid weekly papers in the country, and it was an excellent paper in that we had a syndicated package of very prominent people, Walter Lippmann, Conrad, Herblock, and we saw as our mission being a paper that could tell the other side of the story from the World Herald. The World Herald was an extraordinarily Republican conservative organ, and while we thought we were essentially independent, there certainly was something to be said for presenting a different view. That went on some period of time, and we did well. We established some other papers. We accomplished some very fine stories, motivated by the fact that if you're a weekly publishing against a daily, you're going to get beat on any breaking news because they come out every day. So we would brainstorm pieces that would at least give us a major feature on the front page that was fresh and new, even if it wasn't particularly timely. My father-in-law passed away in the early 60s, and I believe Dave Blacker died in the early 60s. The Jewish Press, which he had owned for many, many years and then gave to the foundation, took the entire front page to write up his life and to honor him. And he had been a driving force in the Jewish community. His friends were very close to Philip Klutznick and Sam Bieber. And of course, the third person that was here at that time that was a driving force for Judaism was Henry Monsky. You had other people that were extraordinary, like Morris Jacobs. And for a small Jewish community, Omaha produced outstanding international Jewish leaders that went on to do so much for the Jewish community in this country and for Israel. Anyway, after he died, I continued to run the papers, and after a few years I sensed that there was a change taking place in the economics of shopping. These papers live mainly off of small businesses in South Omaha, North Omaha, Benson, West Omaha, and the chains were moving in, discount stores were moving in, and I thought, I don't like the future of this. Plus, I was told that a highway was going to come through our building, and I'd have to buy a new press, and that was an enormous amount of money that I was not prepared, that I both didn't have and wasn't prepared, the way I looked at the business in the future, to borrow. And so I decided to sell the papers, and I had a number of people interested in them, and a number of people I liked. I'd met Warren Buffett, but just briefly. Actually, I knew Warren Buffett's wife quite well, Susie, because she and I were both jazz fans. But this Chuck Peterson that I mentioned earlier had room for a time with Warren in college, and through Chuck I got to know Warren. And as I took the time, as I should have and did, to think hard about who ought to buy these papers, not only from the standpoint of where I would wind up, but also from the standpoint of the paper's future and their serving the public. And I decided that Warren Buffett was the individual. Warren had a keen sense of the responsibility of newspapers in the community. He had the wherewithal to make sure that they didn't suffer from loss of editorial staff. And so I sold the papers to him effective January 1, 1969. I liked him so much I stayed on and ran the papers for him. And I had an editor earlier named Paul Williams who had headed the Associated Press in Omaha, and then he left and went to work doing work for Leo Daily, and I hired him back, and Warren loved to explore what could be done with the influence and the coverage papers can provide. And we would brainstorm ideas largely for investigative pieces. And so each week we would break with something major that we had brainstormed, felt that it was worthy, and did a good job of researching and writing. And out of that came a number of terrific stories or sections. We did when the University of Omaha fell on bad times and didn't quite know what to do, they finally concluded that they ought to be merged into the Nebraska system. And we published a 24-page tabloid talking about how that process should take place, and it was used very heavily as that change did take place. That was the years, early 70s, where people were beginning to become aware of the environment, and I had an idea for doing two tabloid sections, which would be one on identifying the problem and two, identifying the solution, but going beyond just carrying the stories. So I arranged for the environmental clubs at two high schools to visit on this given day, which the governor named as Environmental Day, and we had a big badge printed up. And I arranged for each of these students to meet with a leader in in Omaha, either a labor leader, a prominent corporate leader, a religious person, and that was really a terrific effort, and I liked it because we were able to extend the reach and influence of what was by then called the Sun newspapers. And in fact, the year after we published that, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which is the premier scientific organization in this country, annually would award select on a paper for an award over 100,000 circulation and under 100,000. And the paper selected for over 100,000 was the New York Times, and the one under 100,000 was this weekly group. And weeklies just didn't do that much in those days, this weekly group in Omaha, Nebraska. So that was tremendous recognition. Then, occasionally, or some regularity, Paul Williams and I on Sunday night would go over to Warren's house, and we'd think and brainstorm what would be good subjects that would make a contribution to society, that would be investigative primarily in nature. And we turned out some terrific investigative pieces. In fact, a couple people told me that the business community was more concerned about a story in the Sun than they were in the World Herald, because we were doing these investigative pieces. On the environmental piece, for example, we threatened to sue the government if they didn't give us the name of the 23 largest polluters in Omaha. And they came forth, and we printed the names of those 23 largest polluters. And in those days, that was quite startling because people didn't really recognize how serious the issue of pollution was. And if they did, they thought it was in New York or Los Angeles, not in Omaha. But one time I got a call from Warren, and he said that he had a conversation with a person and that he thought there probably was a terrific story about Boys Town. And Boys Town, of course, was like motherhood in this community. Father Flanagan, the saint, all that kind of type of thing. But so Paul and Warren and I got together and we brainstormed the idea of doing this story on Boys Town. And we, to this day, only Warren and I know who that person is that gave him the tip on Boys Town. It's kind of like Deep Throat and Watergate. As a matter of fact, what I'm leading up to is the Sun papers receiving a Pulitzer Prize for local investigative reporting the precise same year that the Washington Post won their Pulitzer Prize for Watergate. So that's an interesting parallel that Woodward and Bernstein have never been able to release, never would be willing to identify Deep Throat, and Warren and I have never identified the source who gave us all this information. After a reasonable period of time, we accumulated enough for a good story on Boys Town. But in talking over with Warren, Warren said to us, and we never would have known this, the Congress has just passed a law that says every tax-exempt foundation has to file a Form 990, which lists all their assets. He said if we could get that form, we would have a lot more to go on, because what we saw is we knew that the census of Boys Town had dropped dramatically. We knew the days of Father Flanagan taking in kids that didn't have enough to eat or a place to sleep, those were gone. Now, this was the days in this country, where we started having problem kids, kids with emotional problems, kids with drug problems. And what was happening is Boys Town was a creature of the Archdiocese of Omaha, and the Archdiocese had plenty of problems getting priests to fill pulpits and that kind of stuff. Boys Town was financially flourishing. Boys Town, I think it was 1938, a movie was done called Boys Town with Spencer Tracy and Mickey Rooney. I think either both of them got the Academy Award, and Boys Town might have won the Academy Award. So they did this picture, which was really heartwarming, about Father Flanagan saving these kids, and Mickey Rooney was a tough kid and wouldn't go into it, but he became persuaded, wouldn't go into the culture there. And Father Flanagan died I think in the early 40s. But after the picture of Boys Town, there was a fellow named, I think his name was Miller from Illinois, called up Father Flanagan and said, I'd like to come to, he saw the picture of Boys Town, he says, I'd like to come to work for you and raise money. So he came out and did just that. And his deal was, and he was superb as a fundraiser, his deal was that he got a percentage of what he raised. And his means were direct mail. And for example, when we did this story, we sent a photographer down to this building in downtown Omaha that was unmarked, had no sign on it, and we opened the door, and the photographer went and took a picture. Here are these many, 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 many women processing this mail. And this fellow says, you can't take a picture of this. So they had it down to a science, and they were raising a lot of money. Anyway, we brainstormed this. We got that Form 990. It was 100 pages long. We finally got it. The government doesn't like to give out those things, but we got it. And when we got it, we not only had the goods in terms of what they own, but we had Warren Buffett to analyze these finances. So we identified $209 million that Boys Town had in terms of cash, stocks, and assets, plus 2 Swiss accounts that we were unable to track. And the headline said, America's wealthiest city, 700 boys with $209 million. And I don't want to take so much time to get into it, but it was so well done that when the World Herald came behind to do it, the head of the journalism department at the Lincoln, at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, said that we had done it so thoroughly there was nothing for them left to cover. We ran an 8-page broadsheet section. That section then went on to win the Pulitzer Prize, which technically was presented to the Sun, but the prize was awarded to the entry that showed Warren, Paul, and myself there. So that was a huge honor. That no weekly paper had ever won a Pulitzer Prize, except I think decades before it won one for an editorial. So that was very big. We continued to go on and do that. I think maybe I'll try and wrap up my professional career and then go back to family. In 1977, Warren came over and Susie came over to our house, and we had drinks, even though they don't drink. And we went out to the Gridiron dinner at Peony Park. And Warren said to me, I'm bidding on a paper in Buffalo, New York, and I may get it. Now, Warren had called me maybe a year before, tried to buy the Cincinnati Enquirer. And the Cincinnati Enquirer the Cincinnati Post didn't have a Sunday paper, but the Cincinnati Enquirer did. And he wanted to know what I thought about the importance of having a Sunday paper. And I said, it's all important, because that's where both readership and advertising is moving. Well, the Buffalo News didn't have a Sunday paper. It was very strong. It was an afternoon paper, and the competition was a morning paper and had the Sunday paper, an exclusive. So sure enough, he bought that, and no sooner did he buy it than he got slapped with an antitrust suit by the owners of the Courier Express, which was sort of absurd because they had the monopoly on Sunday, but they took a position that we were being predatory and trying to put them out of business. And Warren and I would sit in Omaha and we'd brainstorm ideas for gaining circulation, because as interesting and vital as the news product is, if you take 4,000 11-year-olds and send them out with an idea about getting subscribers, it's fascinating to see what comes back. So we'd had one of these get-togethers, he and I was in San Francisco for Thanksgiving, but I was curious to know what happened. So I called him up and I said, you know, what happened, Warren? And so he told me, he says, when are you coming back? I said, I'm coming back tomorrow. He said, what would you think of going up to Buffalo and just taking a look? And my heart kind of sank because I just didn't think of myself. When I thought of anything outside of Omaha, I thought of going to the West Coast. But Warren is such an incredible individual that, you know, you wouldn't hardly turn him down on anything. So I got back the next day, I had dinner with him, and the following day I flew to Buffalo. That was the year of the infamous blizzard in Buffalo, that's given Buffalo a bad reputation ever since. And so I went up there, and Warren and I went up there a couple times and together, and eventually, and it was a real battle. I didn't realize it at the time, but there had been a book written by an individual, Roger Lowenstein, who took 3 years off from the Wall Street Journal to write a book on Warren. And he said in that book that at that time, 25% of the net worth of Berkshire had been invested in the Buffalo News. And they were losing several $1 million a year. And Charlie Munger, who's his partner, wrote in a report that it was not at all certain that they were going to survive. And furthermore, if they had taken the money they spent on the Buffalo News and invested it in their usual channels, the stockholders would be far better off. So Warren said, what would you think of moving up there? And I said, nah, I don't think I want to move up there. And he said, well, what'd you think about going up there 1 week a month? And I said, yeah, I do that. He said, well, it'll just run better if you go up there. So I thought to myself, I mean, Warren's such an easy guy to work with, and he's so bright and so caring that I really wasn't surprised, because he doesn't give you specific orders to do this or that. In fact, one of the joys of my life, besides working with Warren, is that if I've got a problem, I can call him up. And a lot of times he'll have an answer, and a lot of times he'll say, Stan, you'll worry about it, know more about it than I will. And he'll give me sort of not a specific answer, but something philosophical, and I call it getting a pearl. So sometimes I call Warren, I'll say, you know, give me a pearl on this, here's where I'm at. So I went up there and went up there for a couple years, and then I felt like I wanted to get out of the Sun papers. As long as I was getting out of the Sun papers, I didn't mind leaving Omaha. And I went to Warren. I was thinking about either going to Buffalo, because I got hooked on the competition between the Buffalo News and the Courier Express, but I loved the Bay Area, San Francisco, and I thought maybe I should go out there. And I talked with Warren, and even though Warren wanted me to go up there in the worst way, he didn't try and persuade me. He just talked to me about it like a friend would. So I went up there, and I'm glad I did, because I need to be active, even at this stage of my life. I'm not retired at all. I need to be active in accomplishing things. And when I went up there, after a period of time, we were able to grow the Sunday product, and at the same time that we were losing a lot of money, the Courier Express, owned by the Coles people out of Minneapolis that had the Minneapolis Star and Tribune, they were losing even more money. And in 1982, they tried to sell the paper to Rupert Murdoch. That didn't work out, and they closed the paper. And we had just been an afternoon paper, we opened a morning edition. And in fact, now we're one of the few papers in the country that are termed all-day papers. We publish 2 morning editions and 6 afternoon editions. So that went on. It took a while. When I was, before the Courier closed, I really didn't want anybody to know I was in town, because I was working 50, 60 hours a week just to make sure that the news survived. And after we opened the morning paper, I became more interested in what's going on in the community. The Sun papers were influential. I was able to do some good things here. I was a founding member of the Nebraska-Iowa chapter of the Multiple Sclerosis Society. I was a founding member of the Strategic Aerospace Museum out of SAC headquarters, which is now located between here and Lincoln. That's just gone fabulously. And I served on other boards, the United Way and Community Chest and things like that. But in Buffalo, I found a situation where the town was declining badly. Buffalo had been a heavy steel industry, heavy automotive, and starting in about 1950, 1960, they started losing these blue-collar jobs. The town began to shrink in terms of population. They had a lot of people unemployed that either left or retired. So the economics were very bad, and I was concerned about that. And what I did after the paper was stabilized and making money, and the morning edition was out, and the Sunday edition was doing well, I devoted some of my time then to what could be done in the community. And I did quite a bit on my own concerning the economics and economic recovery. And what was interesting to me was, one of the things I did is I had our editor, since I didn't know the power people in town, I asked him to invite in, one at a time, the power structure private sector people, and we had breakfast together. And when I got through meeting with about 40 of those people, I realized these weren't individuals that got up in the morning and said, what can I do for my city? I mean, just the opposite of Omaha. You know, I tell the story in Buffalo that when Lewis and Clark crossed the plains of Nebraska, they sent a messenger back to Washington and said, don't plan on settling this area, it's a desert. And now look at Omaha, how it's booming. And I'm in, if Omaha's at one end of the bell-shaped curve, Buffalo's at the other. So I probably have done more in Buffalo in terms of community service than I would have if we had strong private sector leadership. But we don't. We have very, very little. I look at the people that I knew in this area, like Bill Strauss and Mo Miller, that, you know, they were mentors of mine in terms of what they accomplished. And now I come here and I see Walter Scott every year. I mean, I think it's just incredible what they've done. And so I did quite a bit in economic development. I tried to get certain master plans going for recovery. The paper is extraordinarily powerful. A year later, and I'm back to make a few corrections and maybe talk a little bit about what happened this last year. And I want to thank Ben and Renee for all their work they're putting in. They had to come back and shoot this again. Last, in the original video, I said Molly and Jake Brick, and of course it's Molly and Jake Lipsey. I also talked about my grandsons, Noah and Dan. And Dan, of course, is my son. My 2 grandsons are Noah and Jesse. So whoever watches this, there were other errors, but I thought those were the 2 most important. Last night, as is our tradition, we had dinner with Fran and Jerry Milder and Pearl and Jerry Gross. And tomorrow I'll see my Aunt Rose. She wasn't able to come last night, and Paula was out of town, so she didn't come. But I'm looking forward to seeing my Aunt Rose. She's 92, and she's as beautiful as ever. And I'm going to take over to her a little pamphlet and a couple pictures. And the pictures are something I'm very excited about, and that is I've been working at guide dogs of the desert now for about 2 years. And originally, they let me wash the dogs, let me take the dogs out to the bathroom, but they wouldn't let me near the dogs for fear that I would screw up their training. Well, now I've been there 2 years, and they trust me, and I'm allowed to walk the dogs, and I'm able to do quite a bit, and I find that very rewarding, so much so that I find myself skipping golf and tennis when I'm out there. The other thing that I did this last trip was I wanted to give them some money, and they said, well, you know, if you give so much money, you can name a puppy, a guide dog puppy. So I named the puppy Judy, for Judy Lipsey. And when I told her about it, I think she was more taken with that than really some substantial birthday and anniversary and type gifts. So that was a lot of fun. So I'm taking 2 pictures to Rose. One is me sitting with a golden lab named Casey. And then while the person was shooting the picture, Casey leaned over and licked me on the face. So I've got this wincing expression. But it's amazing. There can be 23 dogs. They know every single dog. But I get to know quite a few of them and get to know their habits and what's going on and report back. Like we had one dog that was chasing butterflies, and you can't have that because the dog has to be focused. The other thing that happened, which was quite rewarding, relates to where I've just come from. Judy and I spent a week in Yosemite Valley, and I did a photo shoot with the 2 cameras she gave me a couple years ago. I've finally switched over from film to digital. And this last year, the director of the Albright Knox Art Gallery, the Albright Knox Art Gallery, was the 3rd gallery founded in the United States. And its reputation is for modern art. They're supposed to be right behind the MoMA in New York. And because they were the 3rd gallery in the United States, they have not only an outstanding collection of the masters, but in most cases they have the finest pieces of the masters. That enables them to call in chits when they loan those out. Anyway, the director had seen some of my work, and he said, I'd like to see the rest of it. Well, he picked out, along with their curators, 5 photographs for their permanent collection, which is really exciting for me. I did a show at the Albright, and I've had about 6 or 7 other shows, including one in Soho in New York. But that I thought was tremendous recognition. The other thing that was interesting about it is they didn't pick anything from the mainstream of my work. And I was kind of surprised, and then I realized when I looked at the 5 pictures, these were largely abstracts, and they're a modern art gallery, so that's what they went for, and I'm just delighted. So the Berkshire meeting is the day after tomorrow. We have our usual cadre of guests. We have a mere 9 people from Buffalo, 2 from France coming in that we will take to the meeting and show them Omaha. Buffalo is really in a very sad state in terms of economic decline. And when I come to Omaha, I just am floored. In fact, I'm going to tell one of these guys, is really my best friend, that Omaha is the anti-Buffalo. I mean, Omaha is just booming, the vitality, and it just amazes me and how far out the city has gone. So this is always a wonderful visit to see family and friends. We just had lunch with Stuart Muskin and Betty and Kibi Kirschenbaum and his wife, and Eddie Malashak and his wife, and Bud and Buster Schlossberg, Eunice and Norm Denenberg, Morley Zapersky, and maybe a few more, I've slipped my mind. But I had the good old Jack and Mary's fried chicken. Anyway, so it's been 2 good years. I'm still here. Maybe I'll be back another year. And again, I want to thank Ben and Renee for doing such a nice job. And I were just talking about the rich history that my Aunt Rose Zigman has lived, and the fact that it would be wonderful to tape her. So I'm going to see her tomorrow, as I said, and I'm going to ask her if she wouldn't be willing to do it, particularly if Ben goes on. I've heard stories going back when Rose lived behind the grocery store, or I'm sorry, in the Old Market area, and she was always a real good-looking, almost foxy type lady. So, and she knew how to sing. She sang on stage, and she was just terrific. And then, of course, she married and they had a wonderful life together, and they were always very, very good to me and to Pearl for that matter. Then there was a period where got out of the shapery and built the ranch bowl. He was there for years, and I would go out there and visit with him. It was a lot of fun. In fact, I went out and had lunch one time. Warren Buffett and I went out and had lunch because it was always so colorful to talk to And I remember one expression that we asked about, what certain expressions mean in Las Vegas. He says, well, if someone says they got the pencil, that means that they can comp dinners and rooms. And if someone says, now I can get my teeth fixed, that means they came into a lot of money. So there are all these colorful expressions that were just great. They were wonderful human beings. Was, and Rose still is. We're always tickled to see her. And I hope that Ben is able to talk her into taping one of these. Ben Nachman, who's filming this, is urging me to talk a little bit more about myself. And so that's a little embarrassing for me, but I am proud of what got done, and I think the examples of what I've done are examples of side.